Well, this video, the sixth in my series of guides to Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, takes you through what Trotsky calls the 5 days of the February Revolution, from the 23rd to the 27th of February in the old calendar of 1917. Now let's remember that the Russian revolutionary movement had been derailed by the outbreak of World War I. It had gradually revived until by February, the flood of opposition was absolutely threatening to engulf the Tsar's regime. As Trotsky describes it, history was picking up the ends of the revolutionary threads, broken by the war, and tying them into a knot. All the accumulated effects of class oppression, the high cost of living, the crises in the villages, the bread queues, factory closures, and with ever-increasing importance, the war, had been building up changes in the consciousness of the masses. What Trotsky calls the molecular process of revolution. But now that gradually rising pressure was about to suddenly shatter the old order. The first 2 weeks of February saw massive struggles of the working class in Petrograd. Strikes and meetings were taking place continuously. The reopening of the Duma on the 14th coincided with a strike of around 90,000 in Petrograd, and several factories also stopped in Moscow too. On the 16th, the authorities decided to introduce cards for bread rationing in Petrograd. And on the 19th, masses of people, especially women, gathered around the food shops demanding bread. The next day, several bakeries were looted and wrecked. The Tsar fled from Petrograd to escape the disorders. But who actually then started the February Revolution? Well, Trotsky answers that point with his opening sentences of the chapter 5 days. The 23rd of February was International Women's Day. The social democratic circles had intended to mark this day in a general manner, by meetings, speeches, leaflets. It hadn't occurred to anyone that it might become the first day of the revolution. Not a single organisation called for strikes on that day. Even a Bolshevik organisation, the Vyborg Borough Committee, was opposing strikes. The fact is that the February Revolution was begun from below, overcoming the resistance of its own revolutionary organisations, the initiative being taken of their own accord by the most oppressed and downtrodden part of the proletariat, the women textile workers, among them no doubt many soldiers' wives. The overgrown bread lines have provided the last stimulus. So let's just explain the attitude of the Bolshevik worker leaders. Because the point is, it's far easier to recognise a potential revolutionary situation after the event than before it. And on the 22nd, the Petrograd district committees, even the most militant ones, had cautioned against mass strikes. Why? Because they knew a general strike would have to pose the question of power, that the masses in the streets would come into open conflict with the police and army, and that there might be no turning back. The most militant committee, the Vyborg Committee, they felt the time was not yet ripe. The Bolsheviks were too weak, and the attitude of the soldiers to the workers was uncertain. However, when on the 23rd those women textile workers, despite all directives, began to strike and to appeal to the big battalions of the metal workers for support, the Vyborg Committee saw that they had to agree to action. In the words of Kyrov, who was one of the leading worker Bolsheviks in Vyborg, with reluctance, the Bolsheviks agreed, and they were followed by the workers, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries too. Once there is a mass strike, one must call everybody into the streets and to take the lead. The idea of going into the streets had long been ripening among the workers. Only at that moment, nobody imagined where it would lead. So the first day of the February Revolution was not, therefore, a planned attack on Tsarist rule, but just a demonstration with indefinite but certainly limited perspectives. About 90,000 went on strike, centred on the Viborg district. There were a few encounters with the police, but the demonstrations passed off without any real victims, giving the workers more confidence for the next day. Now, on February the 24th, the movement doubled. 200,000 workers went on strike, about half of the industrial workers of Petrograd. They went to the factories to hold meetings, not to work, then led marches into the city centre. Yesterday's chief slogan of bread was now crowded out with "Down with autocracy, down with the war." Well, the question was, could the state forces be won over? And if so, how? Well, Trotsky explains that the reactionary and hated police were simply met with a hail of stones and pieces of ice when they tried to attack the demonstrators. Winning them over was out of the question. On the other hand, and this was a new stage in the revolution, the soldiers were treated differently. Men and women approached them in a friendly manner, trying to bring them over to the workers' side. Gaining confidence from these exchanges, the feeling grew that even the mounted Cossacks wouldn't shoot at the crowds. And they didn't. There's a very famous incident that took place outside the Ericsson factory in Viborg. 2,500 workers were trapped in a narrow street by Cossack cavalry. But the horsemen, without openly breaking discipline, simply rode through the crowd in lines without actually trying to disperse them. As Kayarov, that worker Bolshevik leader, recalled, some of them smiled and one of them gave the workers a good wink. So the Cossacks, for years one of the most feared sections of the Tsar's forces, were actually amongst the first to crack. The effect of the war had even taken hold on the Cossacks' consciousness. They'd had enough of being driven against the people and were prepared to stand aside. Now, the Secret Service had based all their plans on the belief that patriotism was too strong for any insurrection to occur while the war was going on. Military command had worked out a detailed plan for crushing any uprising, which they slowly began to put into effect. But there were two major defects. Firstly, like the workers' leaders, they underestimated the speed at which events were developing, and perhaps resorted to their harshest measures, like ordering direct shootings at the crowds, too late. Secondly, and critically, their plan was based on the entire garrison of 150,000 soldiers. In reality, much of this force was made up of reserve units, virtually untrained and open to the agitation of the demonstrators. Perhaps only 10,000 troops could be relied on by the generals, largely the officer cadets in the military training schools. By February the 25th, the strike movement had broadened and become practically general. Around 250,000 workers participated that day. The advanced layers joined by the more backward. A small establishment closed as well. Now the battles became more serious, with shooting from the mounted police being answered with shots from the crowd itself, but even a volley from the Cossacks, directed not at the workers, but at the police. Again, that heroic Kayarov related how he and several other workers approached the Cossacks for help. Trotsky describes it as with a marvellously calculated appeal to these proud horsemen, caps in their hands. Brothers, Cossacks, help the workers in a struggle for their peaceable demands. And a few minutes later, the crowd were tossing in their arms a Cossack who had cut down a police inspector with his sabre before their very eyes. And along with these attempts to neutralise the Cossacks, the workers, especially the women, again tried to fraternise with the soldiers, particularly the infantry, often to great effect. However, these promising episodes were also matched by other reports of soldiers shooting and killing demonstrators. So success or failure was in the balance. Now, in the Bolshevik leadership, their EC didn't make up its mind to issue a leaflet calling for a general strike until that morning of the 25th. And by the time the leaflet was issued, if indeed it ever was, the moment had gone beyond its demands. The movement had now reached a level where what was required was not just strikes and protests, but force of arms. The leaders in reality didn't lead. They dragged behind the movement. The uprising, however, could not afford to lose momentum. For as Trotsky explains, a revolutionary uprising that spreads over a number of days can develop victoriously only if it ascends step by step and scores one success after another. A pause in growth can be dangerous. A prolonged marking of time absolutely fatal. Even by successes by themselves are not enough. The masses must know about them in time and have time to understand their value. It's possible to let slip a victory at the very moment when it's within arm's reach. This has happened in history. Now the government knew that they had to now send troops into action in deadly earnest. And of course the advanced workers understood that too. Now the mood of anxiety was added to by the arrest of around 100 revolutionaries during the night of the 25th-26th, including 5 of the Petrograd Bolshevik Committee. The militant Vyborg Bolshevik leaders were now left, perhaps luckily for the revolution, effectively in control of the Bolsheviks. Now they too were nervous, but in fact it turned out that Vyborg by then was already effectively in the hands of the insurrection. The police stations were wrecked, the officers had fled, and other districts were rapidly reaching the same point, with the police headquarters beginning to lose contact with the rest of the forces in the capital. Now, February the 26th, Trotsky explains, started relatively quietly. It was a Sunday, so the demonstrating workers couldn't assemble in the factories as they'd done previously. Slowly instead, the workers began to assemble at the city centre, until eventually there were tens of thousands in the streets. And the police report on the day's events, if Trotsky says perhaps misrepresenting the workers' attitude to the rank and file soldiers, gives a flavour of the demonstrators' defiant mood. In the course of the disorders, it was observed as a general phenomenon that the rioting mobs showed extreme defiance towards the military patrols. When preliminary shots were fired into the air, the crowd did not only not disperse, but answered these volleys with laughter. Only when loaded cartridges were fired into the very midst of the crowd was it possible to disperse the mob, the participants in which, however, would most of them hide in the yards of nearby houses, and as soon as the shooting stopped, come out again into the street. So this was the pitch that events had now reached, and despite shots from both the police, often now acting as hidden snipers, and from some of the troops, often the trainee officer squadrons, who now had strict order to fire on the crowds, the masses would no longer retreat. At least 40 were killed, many more wounded, but the workers continued to press forward, now counting on victory at any cost. The authorities were putting ever greater pressure on the soldiers to attack, but on the other hand, the counter-pressure of the workers' appeals was also mounting. The garrison could no longer keep up a friendly neutrality. They had a choice, either to shoot or to mutiny. Thus, Trotsky says, in the streets and squares is waged a ceaseless struggle for the heart of the soldiers. In these sharp contacts between working men and women and the soldiers, the fate of the government, of the war, of the country is being decided. Now, a small incident in the evening of the 26th marked a qualitative development in the struggle. Indignant about reports that its own trainee officers had fired on the workers, a company of the Pavlovsky Regiment, under the command of a non-commissioned officer, had marched to the city centre to recall its training squad. And this wasn't any mere mutiny. This was an act of high revolutionary initiative. Trotsky says the officer, whose name is unknown to history, was one of those many nameless heroes of the February days. However, most of those mutineers were arrested later that night. Now, only the victory of the revolution could save them. The night before what was actually going to be the day of victory, February the 27th, the Viborg leaders were tense. Some still even wondered now whether it would be better for the workers to retreat. Even the best of leaders like Kyrov can find it hard to judge the balance of forces precisely, and weighed down with a feeling of responsibility for the whole movement, fear making a real serious error of judgment. Amongst the rank and file workers, however, there was less reflection. Simply a mood that the revolution had begun and that the army would not or could not stop them, and that a decisive victory was at hand. The shootings and deaths had not been enough to discourage the revolutionary masses. And as the 27th opened, to the surprise and alarm of the government, the workers once more streamed to the factories and in open meetings resolved to continue the struggle. But now that would have to mean armed insurrection. In Kyrov's house, over 40 workplace representatives gathered. The majority, but not all, spoke for continuing the uprising. Actually, they needn't have worried so much. Most of the work of the revolution had already been done. The steady pressure of events had now reached the point where the mass of the soldiers were going to now side with the revolution. They had no feelings of attachment to the monarchy. They had no wish to fight the Germans, still less the Petrograd workers. They just wanted to go home in peace to their villages. But unlike the workers, the revolutionary soldiers couldn't hold demonstrations to judge the depth of opposition in the barracks. They had to wait for the moment when it seemed that they could be sure of victory, certain that the workers were ready to fight to the end, and that any mutineers would never have to return to the barracks to the retribution of their officers. And that moment had now been reached. The Bolshevik meeting at Kyrov's house was interrupted by the intoxicating news that a soldiers' insurrection was underway and that the main jails had already been opened. It was actually the Volinsky regiment that was the first to revolt in the early morning. Even the training squad had refused to march out, and their commander had been killed. With only the revolution to rely on, the soldiers rushed to the neighbouring barracks, calling out other regiments, like a flying picket might call out workers to support a strike. The soldiers lined up with the Viborg workers and outlined a plan of action to seize remaining police stations, disarm the police, free the workers from the police cells and political prisoners from the jails, defeat the remaining loyal troops in the city centre, and link up with the inactive troops and workers in other districts. And actually, without much of a struggle, the mutiny of the regiments became an epidemic very quickly. A few shots rang out, sometimes some youths excitedly firing one of the many guns seized from the arsenals, but actually there were very few major encounters with armed opposition. The monarchist command either hid or tore off the Tsarist braid and joined the mutiny, usually out of fear, but also actually for some of the younger officers out of genuine hatred for the cruelty and incompetence of the old regime. Joyful reports of victory flooded in. By noon, even armoured cars flying red flags had come over to the revolution and were spreading terror amongst any remaining opposition. General Kabalov, who had desperately gathered together a regiment of 1,000 supposedly reliable troops, later explained with dismay. Something impossible began to happen on that day. The regiment starts under a brave officer, but there are no results. Because in the white-hot atmosphere of Petrograd in February, even those resolute troops soon drowned in the insurrection. And by nightfall, the garrison of 210,000 had melted away. It no longer existed. In truth, the whole fabric of the regime had decayed to nothing.